loss to society is measured by the size of the production and consumption distortions, and that's also the efficiency lost to the economy for not operating at the free market price. Okay. Oh, I could have put it on there. Okay, so we can conclude then, for this small importing country, a tariff will always reduce national economic welfare. The bigger the tariff, the bigger the reduction in national welfare, right? So that second one might not be so obvious, but just think about a tariff that were half this size, right? Somewhere halfway in between. The production and consumption distortions, the deadweight loss triangles, will be smaller. The bigger the tariff, the bigger the loss in economic welfare. The tariff also causes a redistribution of income. From whom to whom? From consumers paying a higher price to producers, right? We also pay a higher price to the government, and so there could all, depending upon how the government what it actually does with its tariff revenue, also creates another redistribution of income. But the primary redistribution of income is from domestic consumers to domestic producers. Producers are better off, consumers are worse off. We have no effect on the world price or on world economic welfare. Now, one of the things we have to remember here, who are the consumers? Now, typically in microeconomics, when we talk about consumers, or in macroeconomics, when we talk about consumption, we mean spending by people like you and me, right? So we think about households or individuals as consumers. We need to think much more broadly when we talk about international trade. In this case, there can be other business firms who buy tires, right? So think about bus companies, taxi fleets, corporate automobile fleets, the government, right? They got all those cars and trucks and things. So in this case, when we think about consumers, we're really talking about anybody, a business, an individual, a nonprofit organization, a unit of government that would be buying tires. So we want to think much more broadly than just the kind of individual consumption that might take place between you and me. Okay, now let's talk about the large country case. This is fun, large country. So again, we're just going to impose a specific tariff. We know we still get another wedge between the prices. We're going to raise the price in the US, but because we're a large country, we're also going to lower the price in China. So now the tariff gets split, right? US will pay part of the tariff. The Chinese will end up paying part of the tariff as well. So let's think about, this is our free trade situation. So let's think about what this tariff is actually going to do. Let's suppose that in the US, we know that the tariff-ridden price will rise to PT. Now we know that that tariff-ridden price is not the full specific tariff above the world price, right? Large country, so we know the world price is going to be affected. Now I'm not going to fill in everything, but you can immediately see that higher price reduces the quantity demanded, increases the quantity supplied, and the volume of imports in the United States will go down. So we're now going to be importing only this amount. Let's call it M1. Well, maybe I should put that over here. Okay, so the volume of imports has gone down. Those two numbers are the same. So we just take the higher price in the US, run it over to the import demand curve. That tells us how much we're importing. Now remember, how much we import is exactly equal to how much China exports. So this then also tells us what China exports. And for China to export that volume, the world price must have dropped to PW1. And we could bring that lower price over to China, and we see that indeed their exports have fallen to X1. Again, this volume of exports has to be over here. So here's our tariff-ridden price in the United States, piece of T, and the size of our specific tariff is the difference between those two prices. So for a large country that has the ability to influence production decisions abroad, because it's large enough consumer, in general terms, of the imported good to affect the world price, we end up with a higher domestic price, but also a lower world price. Now let's take this center diagram and explode it a little bit. So here's our tariff-ridden price. And here's the change in the world price. And we can see that the volume of world trade has declined. This is one of the major concerns that many people have expressed about the trade antagonism that is now taking place between China and the United States, China and the European Union, and Europe and China, Europe and the US, with several other developing countries as well. That this antagonism could lead to a series of tariffs or other trade barriers being put in place, either directly or in retaliation for the other country doing it, in which case we would get a progressive reduction in the volume of international trade. Now remember, international trade is part of a country's GDP, right? GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus exports minus imports. And remember, those imports are the other country's exports. So trade retaliatory trade protectionism has a tendency to reduce the volume of international trade and then consequently also reduce the magnitude of overall economic activity. Okay, so we've got then two things going on: higher prices in the domestic country and lower prices in the foreign country or the exporting country. With that information, we can now talk about the welfare effects. So the domestic price rises, the foreign price falls. By the way, notice that even in this model, I mentioned this with the small country model, we can have a prohibitive tariff. Right? We can make the tariff high enough that imports go to zero. Then you have weird things go on. Okay, so let's A, B, C, D, E. Okay, so what we've seen here is that when we put the tariff on, quantity demanded falls, quantity supplied increases, the volume of imports declines. Change in consumer surplus. So notice consumers are worse off, paying higher prices, and they're worse off by A, B, C, and D. Well, that sounds just the same as we had before. Now remember, these areas are different, right? Small country, the tariff-ridden price rose by the full amount of the tariff. Here, the tariff-ridden price is less than the full amount of the tariff. So consumers are worse off. Producers gain area A. That looks the same. And then we've got the government revenue. So the revenue of the government is the size of the tariff, which is here, T, our specific tariff, times the volume of imports that we have, which will be areas C and E. So notice the price of our imports has gone down, but we collect the entire tariff on all of our imports. Yes, the price of imports has gone down, but if we've got a $4 per unit tariff, it's on this amount, which is, of course, why the tariff-ridden price does not rise as far. So the net effect here, or the net change, looks like minus B, minus D, plus E. Uh-oh, they don't all have minus signs. So we still have B, we still have D. These are still deadweight losses, these are still efficiency losses, these are still production and consumption distortions. Right? So all the names we used before, still true here. But we also have area E. Area E. So area E is the terms of trade effect. So what is the terms of trade? I know the exam was over, your brain just... I'm sorry? Okay, so the terms of trade is the price of our exports divided by the price of our imports. Notice that the price of our imports has gone down, so our terms of trade have gone up. So this is a terms of trade gain to the country, which of course is why it has a plus sign in front of it. So we've got consumption and production distortions, B and D. They're clearly losses to the economy, but we also have this terms of trade gain. And that's clearly an advantage to the country. The imports we bring in are now cheaper than they would have been otherwise. In essence, part of the tariff is actually being paid by foreign companies because they're selling now on the world market at a lower price. Now notice, the net effect to a large country is actually ambiguous. It depends upon whether these terms of trade effect, area E, is larger or smaller than the consumption and production distortions. If E is relatively small, then obviously it's still a net loss. If E is really large, relatively, then you can actually get a gain. The only way E would be really large is if you were a monster country and you could really push down the world price. So taking advantage of your country's market power in international markets is one way to increase the size of the terms of trade. Now, of course, that's what we often refer to as a beggar thy neighbor policy, or the use of monopoly power, which, yes, while it can be done, is not really viewed as plain fair. And so when countries do these kinds of things, there's often quite a bit of pushback. Another thing to notice here, as the size of this tariff gets bigger and bigger, the volume of imports is going to get smaller and smaller. So as we increase the tariff rate, the terms of trade effect will first grow, reach a maximum, and then start to shrink. The terms of trade effect for a prohibitive tariff are zero. You have no imports, so there's no terms of trade effect. Remember, this terms of trade effect, these are real dollars. These are dollars that are received by the government. But if you have no imports, you don't collect any tariff revenue on it. So it's possible to actually figure out what is known as an optimal tariff. An optimal tariff maximizes the difference between the terms of trade gain and the production consumption distortions. That is, it maximizes the positive value, if there is one, here. Typically speaking, that optimal tariff will be fairly low. Low tariffs mean that your production consumption distortions are fairly small. Okay, so that small tariff could raise national economic welfare, but once the tariff is too high, welfare declines. And actually, too high is not very high. Once again, we've got a redistribution of income, but notice it's not just a redistribution of income from consumers to producers, it's also a redistribution of income from foreign producers to the domestic government, because they're accepting a lower price. That said, the main redistribution effect is clearly from consumers to producers.
Is there also an effect to foreign consumers?
Yes. Yes, so we're only looking at this from the U.S. perspective. So because the world price is changing here, there would also be welfare effects on the rest of the world. Lowers the world price and affects foreign economic welfare. And lowers foreign economic welfare. Foreign consumer welfare is better off, but foreign producer surplus has gone down. Remember, they're an exporter, meaning their supply curve lies to the right of their demand curve. So producers will be losing, foreign producers will be losing more than foreign consumers will be gaining. Okay, next time we're going to talk a little bit more about tariffs, and then we're going to go on to import quotas.